Good morning, everyone, and welcome to what is now the fifth session of the Global Studios Forum on the Future of Architecture and Architectural Education. And I just wanted to start this morning with the mural board, which we're having content and resources from all of the sessions on a single mural board, just to sort of see how these different conversations speak to each other, as well as a resource bank for this conversation about the future of architecture. I wanted to also remind people of the upcoming events on Monday. We have a lecture from Bill Buxton, Sketching User Experiences. And then on the 21st of April, we'll be having our first mentoring event. And so the times and dates will be finalized on that likely today, actually, and the registration will be opening. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank the students who have been involved in this this month of sessions. We've just had amazing student involvement, and it gives one tremendous hope about the future to hear these amazing young voices. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank all of them this morning. And now I'll hand things over to Douglas, who will introduce Phillip Beesly, who we're really looking forward to his lecture this morning.
Thank you very much, Kristen. And again, I would also like to echo her thanks to the students who have been doing so much wonderful work in order to keep the Global Studio going and to really add a really important voice to it. I will just check in with Kristen, though. Is Bill speaking on Tuesday, March the 29th, isn't he? You're muted, but.
Sorry, yes, at 9 a.m. Mountain Standard Time on Tuesday the 29th.
And I'll just, while we're mentioning it, if you don't know Bill Buxton's work, he looms very, very large in the world of computers and human interaction. And we'll talk about this on next Tuesday, but he wrote an incredible book called Sketching User Experiences, which is perhaps the best book on design that's been written in the 21st century. So it's also, in addition to today's talk, it's also one that you very much would like to attend. And with that, though, I do want to welcome everybody. I'm Douglas MacLeod. I'm the chair of architecture at Athabasca University. And this is a special, this lecture and the Bill Buxton lecture are kind of special ones, as it's a joint presentation of the Faculty of Science and Technology and the Global Studio. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. One of the things, though, that we've been exploring in the Global Studio, though, is the fact that we need to move beyond just racing through a land acknowledgement when we start these things. And in that respect, I wanted to share something with you. And Kristen, I'm going to ask you to stop sharing, and I'm going to try and share my screen. And let's see if we can do this. Yes, hopefully you can see this map of the world. Wanda Della Costa shared this with us a few months ago. It looks at indigenous people around the world, and you can zoom in on the various parts of the world, and you can see that this issue of land is a critical one. It's not just a local issue. It's not just a regional issue. It's not a national issue. It's a international issue that has impact around the world, and that's one of the things that people are exploring in the Global Studio. And so, in the effort to move beyond just acknowledging this situation, we would invite you to participate in this map and check it out yourself. I will put the URL in a little later in Philip's talk so people aren't distracted, but I will put the URL into the chat box. But with that, I did want to move towards talking about Philip. This whole little mini lecture series is we wanted to find speakers who cut across boundaries and whose work addresses all of the centers in the Faculty of Science and Technology, which includes, of course, the Center for Architecture, the Center for Science, but also the Center for the School for Computing and Information Systems. And in that respect, Philip is a great one for this lecture. He is an architect in Toronto. He is a professor at Waterloo, but he's also the director of the Living Architecture Systems Group. And we're very proud to be a member of that. But it's an international group, and the key question that it addresses is, can architecture integrate living functions? And in responding to this question, Philip and the LASG, they're deeply engaged with computational design, but also with disciplines like biology and chemistry. And so it does cover all of the things that the Faculty of Science and Technology covers. I have to add in here on a personal note, I've worked with Philip for close to 20 years on projects like the Canadian Design Research Network, the Resource Positive Envelope Design Project, and Philip is also a part of our global studio. And through that work, I know this is somewhat of a strange statement, but I really have come to believe that Philip and the LASG represent the future of architecture. And, the extraordinary environments that he's going to show you this morning that move, that interact with the occupants, it's a dramatically different approach to how we occupy space. And of course, his work is getting more and more recognition around the world. As near as I can see, he's been representing Canada not once, but twice at the Venice Biennale for Architecture, which is one of the most prestigious events in the world, but also in museums and galleries all over the world as well. But finally, I want to give lots of time to Philip, but I have to point out, I've been in architecture for a long time, and many architects can be tremendously overbearing and very, very egotistical. It is a delight that Philip bucks this trend and is also a kind and generous human being. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Philip. We're very much looking forward to this.
Douglas, thank you so much for that absolutely lovely introduction. I really wish that my mom was listening, my beloved agent mom. That made me feel really great. And you sketched a sense of the strained world, as well as the hope that we share. I should say that the extraordinary inclusiveness of the Global Academy, this wonderful group that is gathering here today and that's being shared in recordings, is a project that I really believe in, and I'm very, very honored and happy to have the chance to contribute to it. Thank you for bringing me into this circle today. What I'm going to try to share with you today, colleagues, is a vision for working in a way that tries to think of architecture beyond sheer emplacement, that is framing ourselves and making our territory and creating home, as a way also of crafting conversations with those around us, as a way of building thresholds and connections, and of making a world that truly is viable. Now, the things I'm saying there are really very hopeful ones, and hope is being very sorely tested today. It's almost impossible to put into words the seriousness and the strains that are happening as we speak. And yet it seems very important to gather our work and to gather a kind of resolve which is fundamentally optimistic, that is, to work hard and to give. And I do hope that the things that I'm going to share today do justify some optimism. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to ask for your forgiveness too, because I have a bumpy presentation which has a technical flaw in it. That is to say, it's going to be a bit of a compromised screen. I hope you'll just work with me on that. I'm going to introduce the studio, and then I'm going to talk about some principles of space, where I'm going to try to suggest that space itself could be renamed as something much more fulsome. And then I'm going to try to build on that with some technical things, that is to say, ways of making sensitive new environments. And then I'll show 3 or 4 projects. One called Meander, another, some dress collaborations with beloved friend Iris van Herpen, a beautiful project called Super Bloom that was done in celebration of Black Emancipation Month this past year, and then Grove from the Venice Biennale. And I hope that will give a sense of a range of possibilities that might be a contribution to architecture. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, and I hope that now will show at least a workable screen, although I don't think that it's a completely fulfilled one. Can I just get a thumbs up that the screen is showing?
It is showing, Philip.
Thank you very much. So colleagues, let me just skip through a few images that give a sense of where I'm coming from. And I have to ask the screen to cooperate. Okay, so I've already spoken about the sense of the fragility and the seriousness of the world, our active standing in the world. I'm going to try to come back to this question of what the foundation and what the ground can be. But let me just skip through a few images, such as the Venice Biennale for Architecture 12 years ago, Hylozoic Ground, where we did a kind of a chorusing work that was quite fulsome. Or Epiphyte Chamber in Seoul, in which the layers of material wrapped around us. Or some of the work with Iris van Herpen, which I'll show a little later, in which this sense of architecture wraps around the personal body as well. In this image, you can see a great bubbling sphere, and we started to work with much more deliberately with sort of shells and organizations of cellular geometry that might make very resilient architectures in the future. And some of those are deeply full of glasswork and rather delicate elements that take advantage of the shells and the shelters within the material. Some of them are set up as exhibitions, such as Astrocyte in a very, very large warehouse in Toronto some years ago, where we can encounter these shells and nests. And some are set up as quite optimistic public places, such as Grove in the Arsenale building, the old shipbuilding at the north side of the Giardini in the Venice Biennale grounds, where we set up Grove that worked together with a cloud and multiple speakers and a film project as well. Now, those kinds of projects then all revolve around the idea that some new models, new ideas of ways of putting things together could really be at service in architecture. And I'm going to start in this talk by trying to talk about one fundamental model, that is of space itself. I'm looking at an image from the Hubble telescope on the screen. I hope you can see it too. And these little extraordinary clusters of star mass and galaxy that on one hand give us a sense of tremendous connection, and yet at the same time, I feel that this image itself tells me also that I'm somehow unutterably alone, in the sense that what's between all of those little clusters is something that I've been taught, at least in my childhood and in the traditions that I come from, as being essentially empty, void. This is perhaps a proud thing in my past. I wonder whether you had a similar upbringing to me, where I was told that, well, religion is a rather old thing, and actually we should get used to the idea that in existence, there is no God, there is no religion. There's just the fact of cold reality. And that translates into a sense that space is empty. Yes, we have living things in it. Yes, fundamentally they're atoms, but the gaps in between atoms are empty. And this sense was a rather proud one in my past. That is to say, I was proud of being an atheist. I was proud as a teenager of demolishing things. I think it's perhaps a cultural tradition that I come from in the middle of the 20th century. And this beautiful set of sculptures by Alberto Giacometti, which speaks about this kind of existentialism in which individual people walk through space, but are somehow corroded by space, a kind of a festival of emptiness. This sense is somehow a virtue, at least in some of our culture, a Western culture, the culture of existentialism, of seeing the fact of reality as wrapping all the way around us. I'm looking at another image of Alberto Giacometti. And I think that this kind of sense gives rise to an architecture as well, the project that says architecture should actually be as stripped and as hardened as possible so that it can support free human action, as if we don't want to interfere with space, as if we don't want to determine behaviors. Instead, we want to somehow make a no trace environment. And if we look at images of contemporary architecture from the late 20th century, such as this extraordinary image of Mies van der Rohe's great podium. We could think of the Seagram Center in Chicago. We could think of the Toronto Dominion Center in Toronto. We could certainly see a kind of minimal architecture which has a festival of kind of a hardened surface, the maximum freedom of individuals, but really fundamentally seeing architecture as something which withdraws and which limits itself and leaves the living for others. I think that this actually relates to a much longer tradition, and perhaps I could give this image of humanism itself, the icon of humanism, in Leonardo da Vinci's image of the Vitruvian Man, Vitruvius, the Roman writer who wrote in about 100 AD of the Common Era, who said that, okay, here is the messy business of humanity, that is our own organic bodies, but circumscribing that at the outer bounds of what we can touch is a pure world in which we try to make things as minimal as possible, as clear as possible, as bounded as possible. This tradition of humanism, which values the pure and the distilled and the clean and the hardened, the shells around us, is one that I think has a kind of a beauty to it, but also, may I suggest, an ugliness as well, an irresponsibility, in the sense that making architecture with the greatest clarity of boundaries most certainly benefits those who lie inside those boundaries, most certainly creates clarity, but there is always someone who is outside. There's always someone who is excluded as well. And so this raises the question of, for whom is this kind of architecture? And what kind of dimensions does it offer? I want to suggest that if we think of the definition of space as being empty, then there's some very, very interesting new physics that justifies seeing space as being wholly different than that. And when I look at an image like this one that's coming up on the screen now, the large Bolshoi Simulation, this is an image of space as well, a contemporary image of space. It's an image of all known radio transmissions gathered together and simulated in this extraordinary kind of overlay of multiple, almost innumerable clouds of data. Bolshoi means grand, complete. And what do we see when the layers of data are all compiled together of all known spatial transmissions in the entire universe? This is just a small fragment of the whole simulation. To me, I can't resist seeing the most extraordinary kind of filamentary network of tissue upon tissue upon tissue that somehow I project a warmth and presence into. A very tangible sense of space as being fulsome rather than empty. And I can't really resist then thinking about space and using different names for it when I look at this kind of imagery. I'll just try to play another image of the same material, and here you can see it just spinning and you can see how it accumulates. And I hope you can see the kind of filamentary tensors and very tangible tissue-like cellular accretions that live inside this. And we can see this at very different scales. I'll play another little animation here, and perhaps you can see the image of the sun itself boiling very slowly as similar kind of filamentary tessellations and cellular accretions gently move across the screen. What this suggests to me is that a rather older name for space could be used, ether. When I think about ether as a name for space, I'm quoting Einstein himself, because Einstein actually spoke of ether when he was coining the general theory of relativity. He didn't shirk at all from looking at projections of presence and a tangible kind of participation in the stuff of the universe. Very different from trying to disembody and distance ourselves. So I hope you can see that from this, I'm trying to construct a sense of relationships that we might contribute as architecture. And in that, I love the sense that the boundaries between my own body and the space around me, and the gaps between that and the world around that, are ones very, very much of a continuum, a sense of a kind of a tangible presence, rather than needing to strip things away and to clarify prematurely and to make shells and to create boundaries. The sense that politics need walls, for example, is one that's a difficult question today, in the sense of how walls can absolutely emplace us, but also harm us greatly and polarize us. And so I hope that you can see that in this architecture then, the attempt is to construct a deeply, deeply inclusive kind of model of space, which, yes, creates some boundaries and some phase changes, but looks very much at the possibility that we are not alone at all, that others are with us, that we're connected to other beings, not simply centered on humanity, and that there is a kind of a continuum. This turns then into a vision of architecture in which multiple boundaries are constructed. And it works very, very differently than the idea of making a maximum clear envelope in the humanist tradition. Now, I want to emphasize that there are practical ways to construct this architecture, but it starts from a sense of a model of space where, rather than reducing things to the minimum possible envelope, we look for reticulation and maximum kind of extensions. And this principle of design, of making things deliberately vulnerable and making things deliberately extended, produces some very interesting operations in thermodynamics, in which we exchange and react, some very, very different ways of working with shelter, in which we harvest in forces and dissipate them rather than resist them. And I hope that we can think of many practical examples. Let me give just one. When we look at the operation of this lovely snowflake, as it seeks to shed the heat, or as the surrounding environment pulls all of the little residues of heat out of it, pulling the material of this snowflake into kind of a maximum reticulation, extraordinarily vulnerable, multitude of reaction faces. The searching for maximum reaction phases might be conceived as a kind of envelope for architecture, which I really love as a model. And that, of course, introduces all kinds of problems as well. But I want to try to just indicate some of the kind of practical ways that we've been developing this. It starts with this image, and I apologize for being small on the screen. I'll try to enlarge that right now just a little bit. As you can tell, I'm just working with a broken projection right now, but I hope it works. This is one of the little mechanisms that go together in the architecture that I now practice. And the attempt is to draw out the reaction faces of an individual material by using very thin material that's compliant and resilient, and then drawing it in a very careful way so that it has as much precarity as possible right at the very edge of its ability to span. And at that edge of performance, a tremendously lively kind of behavior starts to emerge. Let me suggest another example of working with this kind of set of forces in this model of quasi-geostrophic turbulence. I love that term, geostrophic, meaning the turning surfaces of the world. And quasi-geostrophic turbulence is something that happens when forces are very, very nearly aligned. And so you have tipping points back and forth, gently moving in one direction or another across multiple phase changes. And this is quite different than the kind of fearsome kind of actions of a hurricane or a tornado. Perhaps we could think of very gentle examples where things just shift back and forth. And I really love that idea that could be a model for an architectural space, constantly refreshing itself. So as you can see, I'm really advocating a renewal of some of the basic terms of architecture. When I've been talking about walls and boundary making, perhaps we could think of different models of how to make boundaries, such as that of a manifold, of multiple kind of many chambered elements. And that suggests, I think, that it could be very useful to use a different attitude towards space rather than conceding it to be void. We could think of some of the extraordinary results from CERN, the Great Hadron Collider, and the instruments that are outside of Geneva, in seeing that now it's possible to work at least conceptually, that there is a Higgs field in which mass arises, that space itself is fulsome and full of potential. So let me then skip through just a couple of images that start to show how the studio has been working with that conception in building up a sense of great participation. In Sybil, at the Biennale of Sydney, we used many, many elements, and I'm just going to show a video of this, where I hope you'll be able to get a feeling for the kind of chained reactions of many small mechanisms, such as the shape memory alloy elements that I was sharing with you a moment ago in detail. And those were layered together into multiple kinds of walls and shells and filters all around us, so that we could move as if through a great saturated forest. Each of the elements is quite tough. It's made of mylar and silicon and very thin sheet stainless steel. It dissipates its forces, and so if you push or prod it, it can handle the kind of behaviors. And so it sort of testifies to a different model of how to build architecture that's very different than the kind of deeply condensed vitrified walls that fight off floods and tornadoes. Rather, we could think of something like a wetlands in which multiple plant elements are chained together, but can handle all kinds of varying forces, while at the same time, each individual element is really quite gentle. I'm going to show a little bit more from another project, a recent project, which hasn't fully opened to the public yet because of the pandemic. We started working on it 2.5 years ago, called Meander. Which extends these kind of ideas. You can see this outfitting quite a large zone within a large 19th century warehouse in Cambridge. And I'll just play this video so that you can see the behavior of some of the individual elements within it, and then it'll wake up in a second as you see the scale. Reaching out and touching, and then having a vibration kind of reaction that moves back and forth. I'll show just a little bit more of how that works with individual elements that come to life, driven by microprocessors that respond to your touch. And those individual elements then are woven together with quite a large scaffold made of thermally expanded material, really conceived to be a kind of a lacework that makes a very robust overarching shell, which then is deeply populated with many, many individual mechanisms which vibrate, which stir the air, which carry air movement through it, which carry little bits of acoustic response as well, creating a kind of a whispering field that moves all around you. In a moment, you'll see some of the larger shells that sit at the center of this organization here. And I'll just share a little bit more from that by passing underneath here. Here we are. So I hope that demonstrates some of the sense of the accretion that is the multiple individual cells that work with this. There are suspended clouds and filters, and then inside each of the major shells, there's a multitude of very small glass flasks, and they're containing protocell formulas, prototype cell formulas, which have inorganic aqueous solutions in them that start to model just the basic actions of cellular life. Very, very simple acts of osmosis, making little chemical veils. Not literally alive, modeling the possibility of life. And here, I hope you can see some of the vibration that works around these individual accretions. I'll show a little bit of the behaviors that are organized to structure the responses of these elements as well. In the behavior control interface, there's a virtual geometry, which is triangulated, that fills the space and starts to set up some of the same kind of filamentary paths that I was speaking about with the large Bolshoi simulation. Here you can see individual elements running along a kind of a latent geometry. I'll just show another example of that here, where you can see the individual elements working. And so the impulses move through this organization by using some custom software that not only organizes the sensors and actuators, that is the tangible things that we interact with as viewers, but also organizes a full digital twin in which there's a simulation that's running of the entire environment within a distributed computational system as well. And that allows possibilities to be built up and searching to be built up as well. And so this makes for a very lively kind of machinic conversation. Now, what I'll show here then is just an image. Oh my goodness me, that is very distorted. I'll just try to get that to settle down. No, it's not settling down. Sorry about this. There's a little corruption in this file. What I'm going to describe it even though it's corrupt. On the right hand side of the screen, perhaps you can see the laptop, and then on the left hand side of the screen you can see a large shell, and there's some ghost-like virtual objects that are moving through the thing. Okay, now I am risking my computer crashing. And I'm going to just try to get it back. So I'll just ask you to be patient with me. Please forgive me. That was definitely a mistake to try to fix that. Okay, so we're just going to see if this computer settles down for a minute, because it's definitely unhappy right now. I do apologize for this interruption. This might be time, folks, for a stretch break, because I fear that if you see this little spinning wheel here, it bodes well, and I may have to restart the computer. I'm going to ask for great forgiveness, but
we do see your spinning wheel, and we all empathize, because we've all been there. So it's an opportunity for us to see this beautiful image. So that's
well, bless you for that. I'm trying to avoid flailing and just waiting for it to I don't know, think better of what I've done. And I don't know whether I should just let it go for a moment more.
Why don't we let it go for just a moment more? And it's totally relaxed, Philip, not to worry. We'll give it a minute. So does anybody have, though, a question so far for Philip? Maybe we could just
welcome that.
have time for a quick one. Now, somebody has pointed out that, let's just see, the need to end the PowerPoint task and reopen PowerPoint. Okay.
So I'm going to restart the program. And am I still sharing my screen?
No,
No,
we're seeing you now.
That's good. All right, I'm going to spare you that. Okay, so I am just going away and coming back, and bless you and thank you for your patience with me.
Okay. Are you going to leave the Zoom call, Philip, or just force quit PowerPoint?
I'm just working on the PowerPoint, Douglas.
No worries.
I hope that's okay if I do it that way.
Yep. There's no doubt that computers and software have gotten much better and better over the years, but it does, there are still moments when everything, and you get so used to things behaving normally, that's when you get into those terrible situations where it crashes and just when you should have saved something. So we've all been there.
Well, bless you. I'm going to try sharing again. Let's see if I have better luck this time. Okay. So this is still the compromised screen, and I've already apologized, just like a good Canadian. So I'm going to keep on apologizing. I'm not going to promise to stop apologizing. But where I was I was just sharing a little bit of the behavior of meander, and here you can see that behavior playing in which these quite deeply reticulated central shells are fairly loaded with individual mechanisms that then play and support vibration and patterns of shifting light and motion as well as whispering sound across. I'm just gonna change then to another project, because what I'm trying to do in this talk is share a number of strategies for achieving quite tangible, gentle layers and halos and veils as a kind of architectural conception, a practical conception. And so the dress collaborations that I've been doing with a very beautiful fashion designer, Iris van Herpen, whose studio is in Amsterdam, is another example in which these material manipulations are rendered at quite small scale. And here you can see just a couple of images from the Glitch series, which is a series in which laser cut polymers are cut with an offset diagrid that allows the individual elements to be very, very lively. And I'll just show a film. And I'll turn off the disco music, sorry. But I hope you can see some of the oscillating that occurs in the fabric. A very, very simple principle of resilient fabric being cut in offsets. And let me just show that up close, where you can see the simplest of kind of manipulations, in which, that is to say, a slit in repeating offset patterns that allows a diagrid to accumulate, in which forces are continually in oscillating motion, shift and move across a surface. I'm going to share a little bit of process material where you can see Iris and I just working with individual samples, playing and finding the kind of performance by continual experiment. I'll show just a little bit more of that so you can get a sense of the development of this kind of work. So here we cut and we manipulate and play and wrap around our bodies and work very empirically, that is directly with our senses in order to see what might be stable and optimal. Here's a little example in which an absolutely minimal amount of material is stretched and elongated.
And you only have the reflecting.
Cut this in transparent mylar because the mylar is so tough. And then translated into something that's starting to accumulate into becoming the dress itself. So I hope that gives it a taste of some of the work, and then I'll just show a little bit more of the film of one of the dresses so you can see that how it performs in a runway situation. With many individual layers chained together to produce this rather gentle dissipative motion, which creates this very pleasurable boundary around an individual body. Let me shift to another project. And this was a project that was done with Haile Elaine, wonderful photographer in Toronto this past year in celebration of Black Emancipation Month last August. And we developed a myth that worked together with the Trinidadian Carnival, in which a young boy, a child, would have a conversation with a Mokojumbi, a mythic elder, and go through a sense of moving through a great tissue of space, a formative space in which the kinds of materials that I was sharing before, that is the individual cells, might accrete and make all kinds of living presence around an individual body. I'll just skip through a couple of the images where you can see the individual characters and the way they were wearing this material. And then developing this even larger into whole worlds. I do apologize for the very messy screen. Please bear with me in this. It's a result of some software breakdowns, but I do hope that the presentation will show some material that's visible. And here you can see some of the characters that were involved in this presentation. Great, formidable spirits, and then the kind of whole world, that is the veils that wrapped around with a canopy, and the individuals in this tremendous kind of festival that resulted. I really loved the sense of deep immersion in the surrounding space. Okay, so now I want to show one more project, and I'm going to show the physical project, and then this presentation will culminate in a short film that shows the inner world that's projected below. Grove was a project that very nearly didn't happen. And the pandemic had a pretty profound effect on everyone, of course. And in our case, we actually canceled because we didn't think that we could travel at all. And then we were persuaded to try to do a project by remote. That is to say, pack everything up like IKEA flat packs, and assemble a team of volunteers and students in Venice, and then work remotely together with a pretty good digital model and digital twin that allowed a sense that we could really explore how to make the work, even though we weren't there in person. And that worked pretty well, actually. It was actually even fun to do. So let me speak a little bit more about Grove. Grove starts as an idea very similar to the ones that I've been sharing in this talk, of trying to create an architecture of sharing in which the surrounding space is full, and which there are multiple open boundaries which gather. And they use the kind of physics that I've been talking about already. That is to say, many cellular elements working together, shivering and oscillating and trading force as a way of making things very strong and durable without concentrating things into single rigid shells. And perhaps this starts as a kind of an emotional sense of a relationship with space. And I want to give just a little storyboard. I'll skip through this rather quickly in order to try to capture the kind of relationship that we were hoping to give, starting with a whirlwind and then moving and continuing to shift, and a little bit of concentration happening in the center, in which a bit of presence might be discerned. And that concentration starts to emerge as a figure, very briefly, and then dissolves away again. In which the sense is that the boundaries of our own bodies and the surroundings are ones that could be felt to be absolutely continuous, kind of a rather delicious sense of immersion into space in which presence is always there. And with that kind of ambition, then, we set out this public gathering space, this great opening with a cloud and a void in its center, and distributed sound, 40 channels of individual sound, and with a film at the center in which there was a world that was projected. And I'll show that in just a moment, but I'll just go through a little bit of the detailing of the speaker field and of the cloud first, in which each individual thing was quite physical. And then the surrounding cloud was made as a lacework so that it would accept light and then project a great shadow play around. And then looking down, we would gather around this center projection. And I'll show that in just a second. So here we can see the individual details and the center space. And so now I'm going to share, just for a couple of minutes, the digital world that was projected. And it was a kind of a compromise to respond to the pandemic. Instead of making a completely realized architecture in space, we put an awful lot of what we had intended into the film instead, and that represents what we were going to build. And we simply tried to fulfill it rather happily, and I think, by projecting the film. And here we have a little bit of delay just again, so we'll see if it settles down. I have to stay rather cheerful about this, but I also have to admit, my goodness me, this is a bit of a test. Okay, colleagues, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to restart one more time, and I'm just going to ask for your patience. Okay, we're going to just do this.
I think one of the silver linings of COVID is it's taught us all to be compassionate about these kind of glitches that happen, because we all spend so much time on video calls now.
Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, not to worry, Philip. We know you're pushing the envelope with a lot of these things. So and that sometimes has its risks, but we do appreciate all the things that you're sharing with us. So
Well,
we
so much.
we can be patient.
Bless you. You can see me I'm just about to get the film back up, and we'll be up and running in just a minute, I believe.
Philip, I wonder if this is the last film, whether you just want to open it up as a film and share it with us rather than through PowerPoint, if that's the problem.
Well, why don't we see if it works, and then absolutely we can do that if this doesn't work. from the sky. They rise from the earth. I hope you can hear the sound.
Yep.
Okay, colleagues, I'm just going to conclude then by suggesting that I've really spoken in a way that has opposed hard boundaries. I've spoken about a preconception of space as being empty, and I've tried to argue for a kind of a fulsomeness, even using different words for space, such as the older term ether. I've talked about the possibility that we can work with greatly expanded boundaries. And I hope that then this gives a vision of architecture as being something that can be deeply shared, really built with very practical craft, and perhaps resulting in some work where some optimism can be really justified. So I hope that's a contribution.
Thank you so much, Philip, for that, and we appreciate that you've stuck with it through the technical difficulties. But that was wonderful. We do have some time for questions, though. So I'm checking both the chat, but if anybody wants to unmute and ask Philip a question, please feel free to do so. Is there? I have a number of questions, but does anybody have any questions for Philip? I know many of us are Canadians, which makes us very shy as well. But the one thing that if I was a student today, I would be wanting to ask you, what would I need to study, or what would I need to learn in order to sort of work in the wonderful areas that you're working with? Are there particular skill sets that you think maybe students could have in order to do these kinds of incredible environments and installations and other things that you do?
It's a good question, Douglas, and I would say that this work starts with 2 or 3 layers that are really very tangible. That is to say, if we work with individual elements and build them together, working with individual cells, then very quickly we start to work with fabrics and organizations of things. And I love the sense that as soon as we start to do that and chain things together, we move into some really interesting technical performance of architecture. That's very different than drawing the hardened, crisp line and trying to make it as crisp as possible first and making the most, let's say, the most elegant shapes. I think that I prefer the crafts of textiles as a fundamental starting point, like perhaps a patchwork quilt in which we have individual bits of cloth or resilient material and chain them together and make them together in a blanket and then start to work that as a shell around us. I really love that idea that architecture can start with that kind of organization. And then I love the sense that we can draw rather carefully and perhaps use some digital fabrication to be able to use some machines to cut those materials out, or to print them or to carve them, and then for that again to be a very tangible set of elements. So it seems to me that those 2 things alone are tremendously complementary and can really get things going. That together, perhaps just with the sense of moving and shifting and using our own bodies to measure the qualities of things around us. And I mean, it's so fundamental to use your own body and to use your own experience as a way of judging how things will work. It's a pretty reliable measure, I think, of multiple scales anyway. And rather than saying, well, that's only local and we have to have completely different instrumentation because we can't possibly imagine what it's like to be an insect or to be on the other side of the world. I have a feeling that there's an extraordinary capacity for empathy with really rooted within our own bodies, that they can be greatly expanded just by listening a lot. So I feel very optimistic about starting small.
Oh, very interesting. I wasn't thinking that the question would lead to discussions of empathy, but as the world evolves, it really does seem to me that empathy is the one quality that we all need to embrace, particularly in these kind of troubled times. So, but again, I will see I'm monitoring the chat. Does anybody have any other questions for Philip?
I'd like to ask a question, Douglas, if that's
Please.
okay. Let me turn my camera back on. I was really captivated by what you started with, Philip, about this space and how, you know, the idea of, is space empty, or is there something more there? And we've just completed the towards a cross-cultural sketching school, and had collaborators from different cultures who brought in the idea of drawing the unseen, and which was very rooted in spiritual belief systems and in relationship with the land and the creatures around us. And you spoke a little bit about that, and the sort of Western relationship with atheism and the philosophical belief systems. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how that's informed your work.
Thanks for asking that, Kristen. I would say that the sense of control that perhaps a Western education has told me is essential is one that is full of advantage and full of disadvantage as well. I mean, like the scientific method that's been taught in Western humanism certainly makes it possible for things to happen. And I guess the difficulty is that by working in a very clear process where you start with an idea and then you sample it and then you build it and then you try to have what is built correspond very directly to your design, you certainly learn control systems, but the question of what that is limiting by is really a rather troublesome one, especially if we say that your original ideas are really kind of pale shadows of what they need to be to actually be viable in the world. And so then how do we participate and how do we contribute in an inclusive way? I really love the idea actually that thought itself could be a continual evolutionary process. And I mean that in, evolutionary process, that's maybe an abstraction. What I mean by that is, if we think about what happens in our frontal cortex as being all kinds of possibility conjunctions, I think that's actually literally true. A psychologist in the group would perhaps kindly guide me in this, but what I've been taught is that thinking includes all kinds of myriads of pathfinding in which many possible connections then show themselves and resonate. And then there are operations in the brain which edit that and say, no, absolutely not. Yes, maybe. Okay, that could work. And things gather, and then the actual consciousness results after the accumulation. And what this means is that the operation of dreaming and partial understanding is an incredibly important part of what it takes to form good, strong ideas, the kind of continual editing and testing and moving. And if that's an interesting way to think about thinking, then it suggests that we can go further than that, I think, in the sense that could be a way of designing architecture as well. Rather than thinking of the tradition of disegno, that's the Renaissance term for the Italian for design, perhaps, in which you get an idea and then you model it and then you build it and you control and make sure that the idea has been realized, and really try to resist compromise. It's kind of seeing building in the world as somehow almost a negative activity. Thinking differently about what a design can be, and thinking of it as a consistent set of data that is evolving and that you build and that continues to refresh itself alongside the act of building. The idea of a persistent model in digital craft in which you're continually updating and building turns into a very interesting model of design where you're navigating constantly. And that produces a kind of resilience that speaks about inclusion. And it's about making multiple connections and continually refreshing what's around, as opposed to driving home and making one single thing and making it as perfectly as possible. Now, I'm giving a rather long response to your question because I love the sensibility that space itself could be involved in this by saying, okay, so if thinking is a partial accumulation and where it involves dreaming and even hallucinating and finding possibility, and then if designing can similarly take on those qualities of accreting and building and accumulating together and finding a kind of resilient density, then perhaps that turns into the way architecture could actually perform in the world as well. That is to say, okay, rather than here is an establishment, that is, that, okay, here's a territory and here's a clear boundary and other people will take care of the space outside it, but it will take care of the space inside it. If walls themselves could be thought of as thresholds in which many different transitions happen, and if that kind of liminal space was where architecture could be, I think it could make for a very, very much richer kind of idea. And this is based on a kind of a confidence of being very, very involved in the world, rather than a set of values which says, I've got to have my safe territory first, and you got to be on your side, and I got to be on my side, and I've got to be a man, and you've got to be a woman, and let's get this straight, as the precondition for living. Rather, there could be this sense of a really kind of delicious, delayed infant state in which we are absolutely partial beings and realize that we are multiple biomes within our own identity and that we're multiple consciousnesses in our own psyches. And if that sense of a kind of a rather playful way of navigating with the world might be extended. Now, the question of whether I'm describing something that is a dependency which needs to be indulged and supported by others, or whether it's actually the source of great resilience and strength and contribution, is one that we're going to need to debate. But I do want to, I believe that there's good reason to see this as being an act of tremendous durability, not just an extended infantile state. And I guess the evidence is could be when we look at different strategies for handling huge forces. I mean, for example, a normal way to think about controlling a flood in a river, at least in the Western tradition, is to build a very strong armored flood wall around the School of Architecture in Cambridge, where I teach. There's examples of where Cambridge, Ontario has been really, the Grand River has been armored with very strong flood walls that come up high enough to be able to handle the spring surge. And it protects the town, undoubtedly. And yet the kind of the sense of the continuity with the river, that is, which used to be a meander, an oxbow river, in which it was continually washing and shifting and gently changing, and in which there were many, many different relationships with that river, has been utterly changed by that kind of polarization. And so I'd rather like to think about the condition of a wetland in which there are multiple sedges and floating plants and many intermediate layers, all distributed and all interlinked together, as being a really valuable model for how you can control and channel those same forces. You do end up with some clear space in the middle. I mean, there's current, there's open water, but the edges are much, much messier and entangled and continual. And it's that kind of deeply entangled space that I think that architecture might really well look to as it seeks to build much more resource positive and resilient kind of models of shelter in the future. And so that suggests that an architectural envelope might be made of many layers, many resilient layers that are interconnected, rather than concentrating on the kind of the minimum space, the greatest clarity, the kind of greatest satisfaction of your own territory. And so these kind of physical models that I'm expressing, I hope might offer a kind of a translation for the models of space that you were asking about.
Thank you for that response, because I think that fits in beautifully with some of the other conversations we've been having, as I mentioned at the start, and why we sort of put them all together on a mural board. On the 9th, we had a discussion, and two of the panelists, one is an architect from Johannesburg, South Africa, and originally from Kuruman, and his indigenous lineage there. And the other is Tiffany Shaw from who's a Métis architect in Ontario. And both of them were talking about ideas, particularly Dr. Sechaba Mape from South Africa, of ritual and dreaming and their role in architecture, and how we expand our understanding of what is architecture and architectural process, so that conversation isn't met with, as Sechaba said, with eye rolling. It's met with, with evaluing and how we get to that place, so that all of these understandings of and practices of what is architecture and how we develop space are valued.
It is an extraordinary thing. Sechava called it eye rolling, and yet some of the things that Philip mentioned, like the Higgs field, and if you dig into quantum mechanics and you look at the double slit experiment or Schrodinger's cat, you go, these ideas are they seem absurd at first glance. And so as Western science goes further and further down the road, it gets into these territories which frankly are so bizarre and so peculiar that you really have to step back and go, anything we thought about logic and rational progress is just thrown out by some of the new ideas that are emerging about how perhaps the universe really works. But I do, Ben has put a question into the chat, and Philip, he wanted to ask you, how do we take the principles of interlinked space you describe from installation scale to the programmatic scale of day-to-day architecture? Has any of your work attempted this?
That's a great question, Ben. Thank you for raising it. Maybe I could give 2 or 3 different examples, both in technical construction and also possibly, rather optimistically, in how space could be divided up and orchestrated. But in terms of technical construction, we could start with some early projects, so even something like work done with A.J. Diamond and Donald Schmidt in the earlier part of my practice, in which an attitude towards trying to create very deep, thick substance was taken, in which very thin sheets of material were folded back and forth and really developed just through practical physics the sense of depth, while at the same time using very thin materials. We can see that at work in buildings like the York University Student Center or the North Campus athletic facility. Those are buildings that I led during those early years. A more recent project last decade, such as the Stone Road Bank for Meridian in Niagara-on-the-Lake, employs whole fields of individual timber structures which are interlinked into a great lacework, and that produces a grove that then frames large halls, and they're extended into outer porches as well as inside the buildings. And what that produces is a wonderful sense of kind of participation in a cellular tectonic that makes architectural space. And at the same time, there's a very compelling way that the individual structural elements work together. That is to say, each element braces the next and braces the next and braces the next, and you can visualize a kind of a flexing and a dissipation of forces that work together in that. Now I'm not saying particularly exotic things there. This is a pretty familiar way of making space, and perhaps I could say that the Canadian tradition, documented beautifully in the CMHC wood framing manuals, is a really valuable thing to value in its own right. That is to say, multiple sticks interlinking and making greater meshworks. The thing that I take issue with in that case is that while we have that kind of resilient manifold, which makes the architectural scaffold, it seems a shame to stiffen it all up and to ultimately try to tie that and make an absolutely rigid shell out of it. I really wish that we could have the confidence for multiple leaky boundaries and setting up pressure differentials through layers, as opposed to trying to achieve one absolute division in a pressure differential, for example, at a single vapor barrier. So to my mind, Canadian construction actually has the seeds for being very, very consistent with the installation scale that I'm speaking about. But I think that we would need to use strategies that are a bit closer to being like campers. That is to say, when we wear multiple layers and then adjust them to suit varying weather conditions. And so it seems to me that exterior solar shades become very important, and variable shading, as well as the closures of windows, and very likely intermediate zones in just on the inside of buildings as well, which we can really tolerate kind of larger swings in humidity, rather than trying to have a paradigm in which everything inside the envelope is universally available for maximum freedom. The sense of this kind of layering, I think, could go a long way to achieve this. I do think that there's difficulty in what I'm speaking about when we talk about property division today. I mean, in the sense that a development paradigm maximizes, even to the quarter inch, your buildable area. I mean, I'm exaggerating when I say quarter inch, but certainly within a couple of inches, it matters. And that kind of polarization of all or nothing in architectural territory is something that really produces some very unfortunate kind of rigid shell making, which concentrate forces, and I believe are harmful both socially and environmentally. If we could have a much more robust kind of planning norm in which every building is responsible for a layer of the public space. If the sidewalk, for example, were directly a kind of a zone of architectural construction, as well as a much more kind of continuous layer of porch building towards the inside of architecture. If there was a transitional zone that every building could participate in, then I think we'd have the kind of land ownership conditions which would become more viable. But I realize I'm being a bit utopian when I'm speaking that way. However, in some way, it's certainly possible through the kind of exchanges that have been happening, at least in Toronto's realm, in really valuing contributions to public space and public amenity in larger buildings. And so I think even though I'm a bit over optimistic in some of the principles that I'm showing, certainly the seeds of this way of exchanging very generously are there right before our eyes.
And it's absolutely true, Philip. We do tend to make this boundary between the envelope of the building and the rest of even the site, no matter what it is. And I have to credit Trevor Butler with this. He talked in one of our student reviews about the journey of the air, and of course, you could also speak about the journey of the water and the journey of the light. And when you think about that, how the site will affect the air and the light and the water that's moving through it, that's where the wetland model becomes such a better approach. Particularly, I 2 days ago I drove through the mountains to get here to Vancouver from where I live, and I went through first the devastating areas of forest fires, and then into the area where the colossal floods of last fall had ripped apart bridges and highways and towns. And it really did speak to the idea that we need more gentle forms of mediation, given the damage we've done to the planet. So maybe the building envelope almost becomes a unnatural boundary for architecture, and rather we shouldn't. And even the sight lines, the property lines, become unnatural boundaries when we think that the building actually, or the space, operates within a much wider sphere. There's a question from Veronica. Thank you, Philip, for this incredibly inspiring lecture. In experiencing your work, I feel an emergence emergence into nature. I wondered if you could further explain your feelings of what it means to be so deeply connected with nature, particularly with the many challenges we face today. Do you see the use of digital twins helping to inform how we can restore our connection with nature?
Veronica, thank you. I find this a really interesting provocation. Could could the use of digital twins and help to inform how organic connections can be found? And if we have perhaps a popular fear of artificial intelligence, then it might be a very discouraging response. I mean, like the sense that, okay, well, we're already strained, and we go further and further and further away from the wisdom of organic life in the sense of just the sheer artificiality of things. And yet, if we cycle those thoughts, and I must say, I rather enjoy having a kind of humility about my own integrity. That is to say, okay, what's going on in my head, and what are the operations, and how conscious am I actually? And I think it would be true to say that human consciousness is a pretty partial affair of lots of little bursts of let's say feelings of presence combined with all kinds of drifts. And I think it would be true to say that we're pretty much mongrels, rather than the kind of like highly composed things that we might project as an image. And if that's true, then it might give rise to the sense of, okay, well then, I'm going to give a bit of a slow response. I'm going to try and construct an argument where a digital twin is actually a really beautiful playmate and a conversation tool that helps bridge and very, very sensitively creates a connection with nature. But I'll just go in a couple of steps. So if that's true, that in fact what our experience is partial and is accumulations of many clusters in any case, then I think it would also be true to say that our memories and our consciousness are very much aided by external elements, by the the muscle memory that runs all through our body, by all the histories of things, the sense in which external forces can be quite directly helps and aids to consciousness, I think is absolutely true. I mean, anybody who has a library that they love, I think knows that it's not simply that those are souvenirs, but rather they are in fact thinking instruments themselves. When I touch that volume, or when I look at that spine, I have an entry into another cluster, and it might open up something. But in some way, we could say that it is my brain, this composite layer of external material as well as internal material. And in a state of confidence when I think of external elements, for example, like a grammar editor, which is on one hand an expert set. That is to say, okay, it has a lot of history. It's got a relatively closed domain, a particular language. Here's some rules in it. We could actually be worried about it. On the other hand, if we have a rather confident relationship with a grammar editor, I've written something, I put it through a grammar editor, it starts to feed back suggestions to me and I play with it. And I think it's true to say that kind of tool we wrestle with, and we find something pretty interesting in an evolutionary sense when we play with it. It's not at all the case that here's simply an insidious robot that takes over our consciousness and replaces us. It's much more of an overlapping kind of mongrel cyborg condition in a very practical way. And so if I extend that to the sense that, okay, now I have the opportunity in the realm and craft of digital twins, that is to say, okay, I have architecture or sculpture or artifactual virtual spaces which through interfaces are made available to me, and I can carry a small scale one on my phone or through a larger interface. I can explore it, and maybe I even put on a headset and really enter its multiple dimensions. But let's say that there's a spectrum of ways to get at these expanded sets. Then it seems that offers an incredibly valuable way to augment our own understanding of things and to participate. And for that, not trying to be encyclopedic, not trying to be total, but as other dimensions, which then really assist and provoke and stimulate a kind of an expanded relationship to the world in an absolutely practical way. I absolutely love having a souvenir of something on my phone. And if I try to make it completely sufficient, then I'll say that's a pathetic little souvenir. I mean, it doesn't hold a candle to the embodied reality, but it still gives me a portal into the thing. And I think that's a key is that I don't ask these things to be total environments. I ask them to be entries and thresholds and augmentations. And in sometimes they give extraordinarily valuable extra dimensions. I mean, like, the experience of being able to look at something in infrared, for example, or in a time-based summary, so that I can see what happened over 100 days, as opposed to just in real time. Those other dimensions actually are incredibly stimulating and incredibly valuable. So what I'm doing is rather slowly moving into the sense that the augmented thinking space of a digital twin offers an extraordinarily valuable way for me to access the memory and the encounter and the pathfinding and the interpretation of the world around me. Now, the world around me could start with inorganic elements. It could just be social territory. But I think it's going to take other kind of cultural kind of provocations or changes or reforms to nudge that into a fulsome whole organic reality in which living systems are possible. But I don't think that boundary in any way needs to be absolute, in which we're worried about sterilizing the world by using these things. I think it's as simple as using a set of binoculars and seeing what you see, with it. We have tremendous agency in using these tools and then folding in multiple dimensions. And if we combine that with the reality that, in fact, the boundary between the inorganic world and the mechanical world and the living world is incredibly porous, radically porous. And in fact, new physics suggests that life arises quite inherently by the combination in the cellular accretion and the scaffolding of inorganic elements, that it's continuum. Then I think that we can generate a great deal more kind of optimism about these tools really generating something very, very substantial for us, rather than the kind of dystopian pessimism of worrying that it's just part of sterilizing the world. It's absolutely true that sometimes we just get exhausted by a video game and we want to get 100 miles away from it. I mean, you know, okay, let's have a fast on our cell phones. Let's not use these tools. That's there too. So the other side of my enthusiasm is going to be something that we need to be mindful of. But I would suggest that tools that allow us and encourage us to see the unseen, as was said earlier, and that see subtlety and see liminality, the partial nature of things emerging, those are really precious. And I think that this medium, I'm very, very optimistic about this medium allowing a radically greater sensitivity to emerge, which I think would be one of the keys to the renewals that are needed in terms of the viability and the relationship with the natural world.
Thank you, Philip. That was a really wonderful explanation. I really appreciated that you said we shouldn't be concerned with use it, but use it as tools, as instruments that we could perhaps use to understand it better. And I think that, you know, I think a lot about how can our buildings connect more to nature? How can it be armatures to allow nature to do what it wants to do naturally? And how do we mitigate that gap? And perhaps through digital twinning and the different instruments that we are learning to use could help us further our exploration of that.
And if I could just add in, you know, we've talked about seeing the unseen, but, you know, some of these new technologies give us the possibility to give voice to the unseen. So for example, the wetland that we've been, sort of the generic wetland that we've been speaking about, we talk sometimes here in the Okanagan Valley about maybe the lake itself becoming a legal entity so it can protect itself. But imagine we're also working up in the Athabasca River Basin and people are putting in sensors and monitoring things. But imagine if it was also embedded with artificial intelligence so that river basin could have a voice, and when things were going horribly wrong, as they sometimes do, that it would be able to express itself. And that for me is a very hopeful approach. Although at the same time, I remain very worried because we seem to just accept the fact that it will be large corporations like Microsoft, Amazon, and others who will be developing artificial intelligences and will be developing digital twins. We actually have to take control of these technologies at an individual level and own them rather than corporations. I'm sorry, that's my hobby horse, and I won't go on about that one. But it is, we need to think in depth about how these technologies work. And also, Philip, I will share with you, there's been lots of wonderful comments coming in the chat, thanking you for your talk.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Maybe I could just make one more comment about which relates to a very early comment you made, Douglas, but relates to the digital twin question as well, Veronica, which is you were speaking about the power of generative adversarial network processing, the GANs, which has been made famous by Deep Dream in Google. And that kind of processing requires a very large data set and a comparison with other data sets. And if you have those stable, then you can make a lot of headway and sort all kinds of things and search all kinds of things. And we could say that humans are better at sorting and machines are better at searching. And you could say that there's a cooperation between those things. But if they're stable, then tremendously clear things can occur out of them. However, the stability, that is the closed domain of the information that's required, I think is really a very serious problem, because closed domains of information are fundamentally privileged. They're fundamentally limited. They raise just fundamental questions about relevance and representation. So, you know, I mean, I think a trick is to find ways to open domains while at the same time working with those kind of tool sets. And that's simply not solved. because you get just sticky messes and mushes and porridges when there's a continual shifting and leakiness of the domains, while at the same time you seek hybrid qualities and novelty and interpretation out of them. So that comes back to a sense of almost disposition, you know, like that is to say, well, we have to have a certain amount of latitude and levity and sense of humor and irony in looking at the material, and that's really tough in a state of war or in a state of strain, to ask for that kind of levity. But it seems to me that that's exactly the kind of quality that allows some new ideas to be found, some refreshment, some resilience, in order to create viability. And so that might suggest that it's precisely in a time of great strain, wartime, unspeakable insecurity, that artwork is so very important, that the act of tremendously inventive design is so very important, as opposed to turning that into just a drill in which you do purely the technique to get through it. Because the capacity to cause profound harm when we just get through it based on what we already know, rather than the kind of open thinking space in which we can still discovery, is sort of precise. Well, I'm not going to go on too much further with that thought, but I hope it has some relevance today, which is perhaps maybe one of the reasons why I'm personally quite attracted to working at installation scale, while at the same time really working with open source patterns and sharing and collaboration, so that it can translate very practically into building strategies. I do hope that the talk that's been given can be seen to be grounded in craft fundamentally. In other words, tangible strategies that can be shared with whatever kind of cultural indulgence that might require. It's the involvement, to my mind, is the key, and that's what makes it fundamentally accessible.
Okay. I would say, Philip, that your work is very much grounded not just in craft, but in thoughtful craft and forward-looking craft as well. So, and I think the combination of those ideas makes for a very, very powerful body of work. I'm just going to, I know we've gone a little bit over time, and I don't want to take too much more of your time. Is there any last comments or questions that anybody wanted to share with Philip? I don't see any or hear any. So, Philip, I wanted to thank you so much for doing this. The giving us your time, which I know is very precious, is very important to us. I would say from the comments in the chat that it's been very well received. And I very much look forward to what the Living Architecture Systems Group is going to do next, and how you might participate even further in the Global Studio as we move forward. So thank you very much, everybody. Just another reminder that that Bill Buxton will be speaking on Tuesday, March the 29th at the same time. And Kristen, is there any other notes that we wanted to share with people before we let them go?
I think that's it. Thank you. And just a reminder that this recording and all of the other recordings we've done in this forum and through the last year of the Global Studio are available on our website, which I posted in the chat. And I also posted at the request of one of the participants, the access to the Miro board. There's also a button on our website that gets you to the Miro board, because there's a lot of interesting conversation and resources going on there. So, and a reminder that the people are welcome to share all of these links and resources with everyone. It's all free and open access. And thank you again very much, Philip, for your talk today.
Okay, colleagues, the Global Studio is a really important project. I'm so delighted to be able to contribute to it. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank you, everybody. Take care.